She was a hard-working young woman with her eyes on the future.
She was so independent.
She was determined.
She worked 2 jobs.
But there was only one man for her.
She just was so in love with him.
It was our first relationship.
And unfortunately, it would also be her last.
Her mother found the body.
After that, I don't remember anything.
It was so heartbreaking.
But is her death a random act of senseless violence?
That has always been a high crime area.
The investigation will reveal a deadly deception.
Some people are just so greedy. She was blind. She couldn't see it.
October 15th, 2016. It's Saturday night in Memphis, Tennessee, a city famous for the blues.
It has a very homegrown vibe to it. Isaac Hayes, B.B. King, all of the greats, including Elvis. This is a city which nurtures music.
However, there's more to this city of 600,000 than Beale Street and Graceland, especially in Midtown Memphis.
I've lived over in that area all of my life, and that has always been a high crime area since I was a little girl.
On this fall evening, a troubling sensation comes over Melissa Isaac, who hasn't heard from her daughter, 28-year-old Bria Isaac, for more than 48 hours.
She always called me every morning, every evening, just called me all the time. And I knew something was wrong because I hadn't heard from her.
When we was calling the phone was going to voicemail, and it's like unnormal for Bria.
Bria hadn't been into work either.
Bria's mom had spoken to the manager at the restaurant where she worked. She said Bria left for lunch on Thursday and never came back.
So I then went over to her house.
It's around 8 p.m. when Melissa Isaac pulls up outside her daughter's apartment in Midtown. When Bria's mother arrives, she knocks on the door.
Bria!
And finds it unlocked.
There's a couch pushed up against the door, blocking it, but Bria's mother is determined.
Melissa was able to squeeze in through the door.
Bria, are you here?
The kitchen, the living room, and the bedroom are all empty.
I'm pretty sure she sensed that something was off.
Bria!
But little will prepare Bria's mom for what she'll find inside her daughter's bathroom.
Bria?
28-year-old Bria Isaac wasn't the type to go looking for trouble.
She stayed to herself mostly. She didn't drink, she didn't do drugs or anything. She was just sweet, nice, and honest, and quiet.
She was like a home person. Even though she was this quiet person, she also had that funny side, but it's around people she's comfortable around. That's just the spirit she brings. Like when she walks into the room, it brightens up. You know, it just brightens up the day. That's the type of person she was.
When she wasn't spending time with her family, Bria was trying to get ahead.
Basically, she didn't do anything but work. And she was a very determined hard worker. She would go in on her off days. She was very determined to try to have things in her life.
and she wasn't afraid of the responsibility, willing to take on new jobs that when needed, new tasks, and she had goals.
She was an independent woman. She didn't look for no handouts. Didn't look for anyone to do anything for her.
But for all her independence, Bria was generous, especially with those she loved.
She loved taking care of people. She loved helping people.
She'll help anybody, give a shirt off her back or anything. Anything she could help you with, she would do it. She loves to give.
She made sure that she gave whatever she could to those that she loved.
Between work and family, Bria had room in her life for one more person. Her longtime boyfriend, 29-year-old Joshua Fisher.
Bria met Joshua in high school. They were both young. They fell in love.
He was the only guy that she had been with, and she developed true love for him.
Everything was great. They were young and in love. It appeared this is the man that Bria wanted to spend the rest of her life with.
For 10 years, the couple dated on and off while Bria continued to work and save, eventually moving out of her mother's house.
She ended up getting her own place where she can, get out on her own.
She had it over there in Midtown. She was paying the rent, paying the light bill, and everything. Working 2 jobs.
She was independent. She made her own money.
Despite her desire to take her relationship with Josh to the next level, Josh wasn't willing to commit.
Bria wanted to be loved. She wanted acceptance, and she wanted love. That is what she was looking for. I guess she just thought she could change him.
Bria's love for Joshua was put to the ultimate test when the couple broke up in 2011. Shortly thereafter, Joshua began a relationship with 29-year-old Keisha Norris.
That relationship evolved very quickly, and it really was a heartbreak for Bria, especially when Joshua and Keisha started having children.
But Bria couldn't shake her feelings for Joshua. And when Joshua wanted to reunite with Bria in the spring of 2013, she decided she was willing to give their relationship another shot.
Joshua and Keisha had children together, and Bria, being the loving, giving person that she is, she even took in their children as her own.
She even helped with his kids. She'll go pick the kids up, take them shopping, buy them things on the holidays.
Being with Joshua again was everything Bria wanted. While Bria seemed to be on the path to happiness with Joshua, her family would soon be consumed by tragedy. On October 15th, 2016, Bria Isaac's mother has just walked in to find a horrific scene.
My baby was slumped over the bathtub.
Melissa began to scream, crying out of heartbreak, crying out of the rage of discovering the death of her daughter.
The screams can be heard throughout the complex, and Memphis PD receives multiple 911 calls.
Memphis 911, do you need police, fire, or an ambulance?
It may be an ambulance and police. A woman's on a balcony on Monroe in an apartment complex. She's yelling, "My baby's dead, my baby's dead."
We need somebody over here now. Somebody upstairs is dead. Get a whole lot of people. It's something bad happening.
In October of 2016, 28-year-old Bria Isaac was working 2 jobs and keeping her eye on the future with her boyfriend, Joshua Fisher.
She just was working so much, trying to have nice things.
She been had her own place for a while. She didn't like staying on any one period.
She began to work and live her best life and not only had goals, but also wanted to make sure that even Joshua was taken care of.
But Bria's plans would never come to fruition.
On Thursday, October 13th, 2016, Bria failed to return to work after her lunch break.
For the next 2 days, her family were calling her, texting her, trying to find out where was Bria.
Bria! And then on Saturday, Bria's mom went to her apartment, and that's where she found Bria dead in the bathtub.
After that, I don't remember anything.
The neighbors, they called 911 because they didn't know what was going on.
We need somebody over here now. Somebody upstairs is dead. Get a whole lot of people. It's something bad happening.
It was obvious to Bria's mother, Melissa, that her daughter had been murdered.
Police arrive a few minutes later to a chaotic scene.
I didn't imagine walking into a situation like that.
The rest of Bria's family has arrived, and the police have the difficult task of trying to preserve a crime scene.
Where you going? Where you going? Okay. Listen.
The family was just inconsolable. They were completely heartbroken.
Who found Bria? Who was the one that found her? You? Mom?
As first responders try to get information from Bria's grieving family, homicide detectives arrive and begin their investigation.
They're trying to determine what exactly happened here.
It doesn't take long for detectives to find the cause of death.
She has an obvious gunshot wound to the chest. There was an awful amount of blood.
They begin to piece together how the shooting unfolded, starting with what appears to be a bullet hole in the bathroom door.
We could only assume Bria was trying to run. She was trying to hide.
Had Bria come home and surprised a burglar?
She had just left work. On her lunch break, she set out on her uniform.
After a quick look around the rest of the apartment, detectives don't believe that is the case.
There did not appear to be a robbery gone wrong.
There's no sign of forced entry, and all items of value seem to be undisturbed.
Which leaves detectives wondering, who was chasing Bria when she ran to the bathroom and shut the door?
There did not appear to be any sexual assault.
She was still fully clothed.
Detectives note there's a black baseball cap with the red bill on the living room floor, just outside the bathroom.
The way it was laying in the middle of the floor made detectives think that it wasn't Bria's. It was oddly just left out.
Could the killer have left it behind?
The police have more questions and not enough answers at this stage.
Hoping for some clarity, detectives turn to Bria's mother, Melissa.
Ma'am, we're sorry for your loss. We're gonna need to ask a few questions to figure out what happened.
We always tell the families, we're working for you. We're working for Bria now. So we have to try to maintain our wits, and we get the family members to tell us whatever we can.
It was real hard. They was telling me that my daughter was gone.
I know this is difficult, but is there anything you can tell us?
Detectives begin by asking if Bria was dating anyone.
Well, there's Joshua Fisher. They'd been off and on for years.
Was she seeing anyone else?
Maybe someone new in the picture.
No.
According to Bria's mom, Joshua was the only man in her daughter's life.
She hadn't been with no other man but him.
But had there been someone in Joshua's life who wanted Bria dead?
Do you know if Joshua was seeing anyone else?
Keisha Norris. They have children together.
Melissa's answer raises a red flag for detectives.
They've potentially got two women fighting over the same man. Jealousy could very well be a motive.
Did Bria and Keisha have a rift? Was there some level of argument that was occurring there? Was there something that occurred with the kids?
Now, Bria and Keisha, did they get along?
As far as I know.
They were never enemies. She even helped with his kids.
However, even if what Melissa tells them is true, detectives will need to rule out Keisha as a possible suspect.
You have to determine your victim's relationship with everyone that comes up.
First, detectives canvass Bria's apartment building, hoping one of her neighbors can give them a lead on the shooter.
They asked around to find out, did anyone hear any gunshots? Did anyone see anything that looked suspicious? Did anyone scream and yell for help?
For now, detectives have no luck locating eyewitnesses. The next step is to find the two people Melissa Isaac mentioned in her statement.
Detectives put out an APB on Josh and Keisha, but Josh was nowhere to be found.
The next day, detectives do have better luck finding Keisha Norris. But when she sits down with detectives, their suspicions are immediately raised.
Bria Isaac was found murdered. Do you know anything about that?
No, I can't help you.
When was the last time you saw Josh?
Look, I don't know anything about this.
It becomes obvious to the detectives that Keisha knew more than she was letting on.
But what is it that Keisha is hiding? Josh's involvement or her own?
Detectives are convinced that this woman could hold the key to solving Bria's murder.
Barely an hour after Bria Isaac's mother discovered her daughter's dead body, detectives investigating the 28-year-old's murder have identified two persons of interest.
At this time, police are still looking for Joshua Fisher, Bria's boyfriend. But they did manage to bring in Keisha Norris, who has children with Joshua.
At this stage, police is trying to turn over every rock that they can.
With her having a relationship with Joshua, I'm quite sure she had a wealth of information.
And considering Keisha and Bria were seeing the same man, they had to rule her out as a suspect.
But when detectives bring Keisha in, things hit a snag.
Keisha was not very cooperative, which really made detectives question just what she knew.
She was entirely within her rights, but the fact that she was uncooperative made detectives suspicious.
Is Keisha hiding something, or is she merely being cautious?
I'm sorry. You just need to talk to Josh. I don't have anything else to say.
Well, where can we find Josh?
He moves around a lot. He could be anywhere.
With their interview with Keisha stalling out, detectives move on to finding Joshua Fisher.
At this stage, the one name that they kept hearing during this investigation was Joshua Fisher.
While the search for Josh continues, detectives receive Bria's autopsy report the following morning, and the findings confirm their suspicions about how the murder occurred.
Bria had been shot twice. Once in the head, once in the chest. Execution style by a .38 caliber.
Confirmation of the way Bria died only adds to the heinous nature of the crime.
It was felt that she lived a little while after she was shot, but of course she didn't get any medical attention at all.
Now that detectives know the caliber of the weapon used, all they need is the gun itself.
It was going to take a stroke of luck to find this gun. Truthfully, it could have been anywhere.
The one thing that they needed was that gun. Where was it?
While detectives are still trying to locate Joshua Fisher, a look into his background reveals a disturbing pattern.
The police had previously responded to Bria's apartment on numerous domestic disturbance calls.
Joshua abused her. He would beat her.
This revelation about Joshua comes as a surprise. None of Bria's family had mentioned any abuse.
I didn't know about the abuse through the years and how many officers and stuff was called.
However, none of those calls ended with Joshua in jail.
A lot of times the police were called and she didn't tell the whole story or she didn't prosecute.
To detectives, the question becomes, had the abuse escalated to murder?
It was time for them to find this Joshua Fisher.
Locating Bria's boyfriend still proves difficult.
They couldn't find him.
Word that detectives are looking for Joshua does eventually produce results.
A tip did come in as to Joshua and his whereabouts.
He's in the small rural community of Stanton, Tennessee.
It's about an hour or so from where Bria lived. So the police went down and they saw Joshua.
Detectives find him at a friend's house outside the tiny farming town.
Can I help you guys?
Joshua Fisher?
Yeah, that's me.
We need to talk to you about Bria Isaac.
Is there a problem?
News of the murder appears to hit Joshua hard.
He actually cried and stated that he wasn't aware of it.
Despite his emotional reaction, detectives believe Joshua is involved in Bria's murder.
The police wanted to know, did you kill Bria Isaac? He denied it.
There's quite a few incident reports that would indicate otherwise.
Look, I know we had our problems. I had my problems. But I would never do that.
He's an alcoholic. So when he's on alcohol, he turns into a whole nother person. And we don't listen. Everything has to go his way and only his way.
He fought about everything for no reason at all.
He said that they were off. They were taking a break. He and Bria weren't in a relationship at the time.
Where were you on Thursday afternoon?
I was here.
How long have you been here?
Week or so.
Can your friend verify that?
Yeah, I mean, he at work right now, but for sure.
He did state that he was there prior to the homicide, and he had been there all that time.
If that's true, Joshua can't be Bria's killer. But they need proof that Joshua is lying.
Detectives felt like they had their man, but there were a few things they needed to nail down. First, did Josh's alibi hold up? Where was the murder weapon? They needed to make sure their case was solid before they made an arrest.
Okay, we'll be in touch.
Detectives head back to Memphis. For the Isaac family, they now have the difficult task of removing Bria's belongings from her apartment.
It's difficult to imagine how painful it must have been for the family to be in that space. Knowing what had transpired there and not having justice for Bria, I just can't imagine.
We get over there, me and my niece, Dominique, which is her sister, her boyfriend.
So they went over to help pack things up, help the mom out.
What happens next? will change the course of the investigation.
As they were lifting the couch, what falls out? A gun. It was right there.
Days after Bria Isaac's mother found her dead from 2 gunshot wounds, the family believes they may have stumbled upon the murder weapon.
The family was packing up Bria's apartment, moving things out, and when they picked up a couch, a gun fell out.
As soon as the gun fell out, we jumped back. I told nobody don't touch it.
CSIs had missed it during their initial search of the crime scene.
They concentrated on the immediate scene and no one thought to check the couch.
Thankfully, it was still there. And once the family members saw that gun, they called the City of Memphis Police Department.
I said, I don't know if it's the murder weapon or what, but a gun just fell out this couch.
Detectives rush to the scene and take the gun into evidence.
It's a .38 revolver, which is the same caliber that killed Bria.
The gun is submitted to the lab for testing.
Thank you.
While awaiting the ballistics results, they turn their attention to Joshua's alibi, that he was not in Memphis when the shooting occurred.
At this point, there have been multiple stories on the news and more information starts to come in.
One tip in particular proves especially useful to detectives.
Homicide.
A young man contacted the police and said he had some information. He also knew Joshua Fisher.
Detectives invite the man in for an interview.
The guy works at a video game store that is right across the street from Bria's apartment.
They know Josh because he frequents that store.
Detectives are wondering, what do they have with this guy? Is it even relevant to the investigation?
So what made you decide to contact us?
I saw the police outside the apartment where Joshua stayed. And then I seen the murder case on the news. I saw him there last Thursday.
Are you sure?
Yes. He came to the store that day, and I also saw him on the balcony of the apartment.
This is a huge revelation. An eyewitness who saw Josh at Bria's apartment the day she was killed.
The clerk also claims that Josh was not as talkative as he normally was.
The clerk noticed that there was something unusual about his behavior.
It's hard to describe. He was acting kind of weird, you know?
He claimed Joshua wasn't himself that day.
I also brought in the security footage. Hopefully that helps.
Before detectives look at the security footage, the clerk gives them one more piece of information.
I saw him leave the apartment too. He got in a car with some woman.
The clerk goes on to give a description of a woman that catches detectives' attention.
The clerk saw Joshua get into the car with a woman that matches the description of Keisha Norris.
With this information, detectives need to find out why Keisha wasn't more forthcoming when they originally interviewed her. But first, they need to look at the security footage from the game store.
The police see the video footage, and there he was. He had his black hat, a red bill on it. No one could miss that.
The hat is an exact match for the one detectives recovered at the crime scene. And with a timestamp putting Joshua in Memphis when he claimed to be in Stanton, just like that, Joshua's alibi is in tatters.
Joshua couldn't be telling the truth.
With video proof and a witness that puts Joshua at the scene of the murder, detectives now need to bring Keisha Norris in for another round of questioning. And this time, they press hard for answers.
We have evidence and a witness that puts Joshua at the scene as well as yourself.
You picked him up that day, didn't you?
Officers knew that Keisha Norris had been contacted by Joshua.
He just kept blowing up my phone.
He is repeatedly calling Keisha. Obviously, she isn't answering because the calls are non-stop.
Keisha said she didn't answer because she and Joshua recently had their own falling out.
But her phone kept ringing.
After receiving repeated phone calls, at some point she said enough is enough.
What did he want, Keisha?
Keisha finally reveals what she's been hiding.
He needed a ride from Bria's apartment.
Keisha picked up Joshua Fisher from Bria's apartment on the day that she was murdered. She, in essence, became the getaway driver.
Memphis detectives investigating the murder of 28-year-old Bria Isaac have just made what appears to be a breakthrough in the case. Detectives have placed Bria's boyfriend, Joshua Fisher, at her apartment on the afternoon of her murder.
We can guess he was trying to get out of the vicinity of that apartment. He was trying to leave that murder scene.
Hoping to prove it, detectives are pressing Keisha Norris, Joshua's ex-girlfriend, and the woman who picked him up from the apartment for more information.
And where was he when you got there?
He was outside on the sidewalk.
Unfortunately for detectives, Keisha didn't see Joshua enter or exit Bria's apartment.
According to what Joshua told Keisha, Bria wasn't home.
The detectives are skeptical.
Did you see any blood on him?
No.
And was he nervous or agitated or anything like that?
Not really.
She says it seemed like any other day. She picked him up, she dropped him off. That's all she knew.
Now, however, Keisha seems convinced that Joshua is the one who killed Bria.
Why do you say that?
I just know him. And you should have heard some of the stuff he would say to her.
One time, Joshua told Bria that he wished she would be raped, robbed, and killed. And at another time, Joshua stated that he would shoot Bria in her head and spit on her.
I just thought it was all talk. But when he gets drunk, he says things.
So you think he followed through on his threat?
I do. Because she was gonna leave him.
She was trying to move out the apartment. No notice, no anything, just move and not let him know nothing.
She tried to get away from him on several occasions, but she was not successful.
So why didn't you tell us this before?
I have kids with this man. I was scared of what he would do to us.
I'm sure that frightened her. She was just frightened to death.
At this point, detectives have to take Keisha's word. She didn't know anything, she wasn't involved, and Joshua sucked her into this.
Officers were able to rule out Keisha as a suspect.
The following morning, when detectives get the ballistics report back from the crime lab, the findings confirm the revolver that fell out of the couch also killed Bria.
The gun that they found and the bullets that they discovered were a match.
They called back and notified the family that it was the murder weapon.
Now that they have the murder weapon, can detectives prove without a shadow of a doubt that Joshua Fisher killed Bria Isaac?
They needed to fingerprint the gun, see who it was registered to, and then find a way to link the gun to Joshua Fisher.
In the meantime, detectives believe the statement given by Keisha Norris is enough to make an arrest.
Detectives got a warrant and arrested Joshua in Stanton without incident.
The family rejoices at the news Bria's killer has finally been caught.
They called and said they had got him.
When the family learns that the suspect is Joshua Fisher, they are devastated that it was someone they knew.
They were blindsided. I don't think they had any idea that he had harmed her.
I never expected for him to do something like this, to break out trust like that. There was like something you can't get over.
While the family struggles to process the news, detectives sit Joshua down for questioning.
I told you, I was in Stanton when Bria got shot.
We know that's a lie, Joshua.
Once Joshua is confronted with the evidence against him, he realizes that his back is up against the wall.
Joshua cracked under the pressure.
Did you kill Bria Isaac?
It was an accident.
Taken into custody and confronted with the evidence detectives have against him, 29-year-old Joshua Fisher has just admitted to killing his girlfriend, Bria Isaac.
We know you killed her.
I didn't mean to. It was an accident.
An accident?
Yeah.
What he shared with them was he decided that he was gonna have a firearm. Not only was he gonna carry a firearm, but he was gonna now bring that firearm into the home.
Joshua kept the gun hidden in the apartment, but Bria found it.
Joshua's story was that they were tussling over the gun and the gun went off.
It just went off?
Yeah.
And you ran.
Yeah.
Joshua did not seek any type of medical attention for her, nor did he let anybody know where she was.
What Joshua said is he became scared. He didn't want to stick around and call 911.
Instead, he'd called Keisha.
I never meant to kill her. I swear to God.
The detectives are skeptical of Joshua's story. And a look back at all the evidence they've gathered so far confirms their suspicions.
Joshua had a big problem. The story that he gave had to match the crime scene, and that did not match.
Bria Isaac was shot twice, once behind the door, and then the killer stood over her and fired a second shot. There was absolutely no way it could have happened the way that Joshua claimed.
When detectives restart their interview, Josh decides it's time to stop talking.
I prefer that I have a lawyer around for the...
Okay, for that. Okay, but do you have a problem? So do you mind if we still go ahead and take the statement? You just want a lawyer for the video?
For the rest of it.
Okay, so you don't want to talk about anything else?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, you have the right to absolutely do that.
Joshua Fisher is formally charged with the murder of Bria Isaac. On September 17th, 2018, he stands trial. And Bria's family packs the courtroom.
We wanted justice. And my family, we are very close. All of us was there every single day. Because we wanted justice.
There wasn't no doubt in my mind. We did it. I knew we did it.
According to the prosecution, Bria's murder was the culmination of almost a decade of horrible abuse at the hands of Joshua Fisher.
The prosecutor's theory was that this girl had been relentlessly stalked and harassed and abused. And Joshua was just a predator who took advantage of Bria. And not only took advantage of her, but took her life.
The prosecution theorizes on the afternoon of October 13th, 2016, she'd finally said enough.
The prosecution believed that Joshua waited around the neighborhood that afternoon and followed Bria home on her lunch break.
Why ain't you answering my calls? You dodging me?
Joshua, I'm done. We're done. When he showed up at her home on her lunch break, Bria knew that it was time to leave Joshua Fisher. She should have been out of that relationship. It was toxic. She knew it. Joshua could not handle rejection, could not handle Bria getting the strength to stand up and finally say that she's not going to take it anymore.
Based on the crime scene, prosecutors believe that when Joshua pulled the gun, Bria bolted for the bathroom.
I can only imagine how scared she was when she was running towards that door. She opens the door and she gets in there.
But it was like too late.
The bullet went through the door.
Once Bria was wounded, Joshua walked in and fired once more.
She was murdered in cold blood. He took her life because he knew she was leaving him.
Instead, it had been Joshua who left.
He murdered Bria and didn't even have the decency to pick her up off the tub.
On his way out, Joshua had stashed the gun, called Keisha, and arranged his escape.
It's just shocking to me that Joshua, after killing his girlfriend of 10 years, could be so calm, cool, and collected as though nothing happened.
But something had happened, and the prosecutors have proof.
There was basically no way Joshua could refute the evidence because there was so much of it against him.
Between the hat, the surveillance video, the murder weapon, and Keisha's testimony, it was really overwhelming.
Joshua was found guilty, and he did receive a life sentence in prison.
He'll never see the light of day again, and her family could finally at least breathe a little bit better knowing that justice had been served.
We was all excited for the verdict. Yes, we was. It brought closure.
Give him some time to think about what he did and think about was it worth it.
She did not deserve that. Bria was a very good person.
She was very loved. She knows she was one of the sweetest person that, been called home.
She was such a sweet, beautiful person. I never hear her voice or nothing.
The pristine, sun-drenched suburban sprawl of Sacramento County in the late spring of 1991 didn't look like a place where nightmares could take root. With its neatly manicured lawns, rows of identical stucco houses, and the quiet, comforting hum of lawnmowers vibrating through the warm afternoon air. But beneath that veneer of mid-century American perfection lay a cold, calculated violence that was about to rip the heart out of a quiet neighborhood and leave a scar that would fester for over 3 decades. It began on a Tuesday evening when a 16-year-old girl, known for her sharp wit, her bright artistic ambition, and a routine that was as predictable as the setting sun, walked into her family's suburban home after a track meet, dropped her gym bag by the front door, and vanished entirely from the face of the earth without leaving a single trace, a single drop of blood, or a single sound that could alert the neighbors just yards away. The front door was left unlocked. The television in the living room was still humming with the evening news broadcast, and a glass of ice water was left sweating on the kitchen counter, its ice slowly melting into a lukewarm pool of water that became the silent, terrifying baseline of a multi-generational mystery. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no upturned furniture to indicate a desperate struggle for survival, just an absolute, deafening vacuum where a human life had been just moments prior, a clinical abduction so perfectly executed that it felt as if she had simply evaporated into the thick California air. Within hours, the local police department transformed the quiet residential street into a high-intensity combat zone, their flashing red and blue emergency lights cutting through the darkness, their sirens wailing against the oppressive silence of a community gripped by an immediate, paralyzing panic. 9 units tore through the nearby drainage canals and open fields, their deep baying echoing off the concrete walls of the suburbs, while detectives in suits moved door to door, their faces grim under the streetlights, asking the same frantic questions to neighbors who could only offer blank stares and terrified shaking of heads. It was a cold case born in the bright glare of prosperity, a psychological horror show that turned every smiling neighbor into a potential predator, transformed every passing vehicle into a mobile prison, and forced an entire town to lock their doors, pull their blinds, and look at each other with a sharp, toxic suspicion that would permanently alter the behavioral fabric of the county for 35 long years. The initial hours of that 1991 investigation were a chaotic, analog race against a clock that refused to slow down, but the tools of the era were devastatingly slow, reliant on landline phones, paper filing systems, and the limited reach of local television broadcasts that could only do so much to pierce the veil of the dark. Investigators spent days combing the interior of the home with graphite powder and laser lights, seeking a latent fingerprint, a stray fiber, or a microscopic fluid sample that could give their phantom a physical identity, but the perpetrator had left absolutely nothing behind, operating with a level of forensic cleanliness that suggested a terrifying degree of premeditation and control. The victim's older sister, who had been at a library just 3 miles away when the abduction occurred, returned home to find her world completely dismantled. Her parents collapsed in hysterics on the front lawn while strangers in trench coats moved through her sister's bedroom, bagging up diaries, stuffed animals, and clothing as if they were archiving a life that had already ended. The school district went into an immediate lockdown. Curfew sirens began to wail across the valley every evening at dusk, and the once vibrant parkways where teenagers used to ride their bikes became desolate, haunted stretches of concrete that everyone avoided out of a primal instinct for survival. Every lead followed by the task force was a dead end that dissolved into thin air the moment investigators applied the pressure of validation. A suspicious white Benzine idling near the high school turned out to belong to a local contractor. A drifter arrested down the highway had a verifiable alibi 3 counties away, and the initial suspects within the girls' social circle were cleared one by one after grueling polygraph-assisted interrogations that yielded nothing but raw trauma. The case file grew rapidly, swelling into 3 massive cardboard boxes that sat on the lead detective's desk like a permanent accusation, filled with hundreds of typed witness statements, anonymous tips from psychics, and thousands of pages of field notes that amounted to a mountain of data, without a single drop of actionable truth. As the weeks bled into months, and the months systematically turned into years, the fiery intensity of the public outrage began to dim, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic throb of a chronic collective trauma that the town simply learned to accept as part of its daily reality. The local media outlets that had once splashed the girl's school portrait across the front pages with screaming, bold headlines gradually moved the story to the interior sections, then to small, single-column anniversary updates, until finally, her name disappeared from the print altogether, buried beneath the relentless, dawn-dapped tide of new crimes, economic shifts, and the fast-paced, digital noise of the emerging internet age. But inside the home, the silence was an active, suffocating entity, a physical pressure that slowly ground the family down into dust over decades of unceasing, unresolved grief that offered no ending, no closure, and no shallow grave to weep over. The parents looked at the phone every single day, their bodies stiffening with an electric terror every time the mechanical ringer echoed through the hallways, praying for a voice to demand a ransom, or to offer a confession, or to simply provide the coordinates of a location where they could reclaim the physical remains of their child. The psychological torture of the unknown was a cancer that ate away at the structural integrity of the household. The father spent his evenings driving the grid roads of the Central Valley, his headlights cutting through the Thule fog as he searched the irrigation ditches and abandoned orchards, driven by a desperate, heartbreaking necessity to find a shoe, a fragment of cloth, or a bone that could break the stalemate. He passed away in 1999, his heart finally giving out under the weight of a 30-year obsession, his eyes holding a profound, unhealable failure as he left his remaining daughter and his wife to carry the monument of their grief alone in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The turn of the millennium did not bring a fresh dawn or a sudden revelation to the silent house in Sacramento County. It merely thickened the dust that had settled over the ghost of 1991, wrapping the unhealed wound of the community in a heavy, suffocating layer of institutional apathy and fading memories. By the early 2000s, the analog world that had shielded the predator was rapidly morphing into a highly connected digital matrix, but for the stack of cardboard boxes labeled with the missing girl's name in the sheriff's department basement, the technological revolution remained an unreachable abstraction. The original detectives who had stood on the front lawn in the humid dusk of that Tuesday evening had begun to retire, packing up their personal belongings and leaving behind their unfinished binders, their departure a quiet admission that the dark had won, that the phantom who had stepped across the threshold of the unlocked stucco house had outsmarted the collective weight of the law. The case file was no longer a living, breathing operational file. It had become an archival artifact, an orphan of the system that was occasionally pulled from the shelf by a curious rookie, only to be returned hours later when a sheer lack of physical clues, fingerprints, or biological material induced a deep, professional vertigo. The town itself was physically transforming as the old orange groves and open fields that had once bordered the neighborhood were systematically bulldozed and paved over to make way for massive corporate shopping centers and master-plan subdivisions, effectively obliterating the physical landscape of 1991 and burying any potential geographical context beneath millions of tons of fresh asphalt and concrete. For the victim's older sister, who had grown into adulthood under the crushing weight of a tragedy she was never allowed to escape, the passage of time was not a healing mechanism but a slow, industrial grinding down of her own identity, leaving her trapped in a permanent state of hypervigilance and survival. She had watched her father perish from the unceasing pressure of his own obsession, and by 2008, her mother's cognitive health began to fracture under the weight of an early-onset dementia, a cruel somatic mercy that slowly erased the present but left the jagged, raw core of 1991 completely intact. The mother would sit by the window for hours, her eyes scanning the driveway, occasionally calling out her missing daughter's name as if the track meet had ended just minutes ago and the front door was about to swing open, forcing the older sister to repeatedly break the news of a 17-year-old disappearance to a mind that was actively unspooling. When her mother finally passed away in the winter of 2012, the older sister found herself entirely alone, the sole custodian of a multi-generational vault of sorrow, standing in the center of the quiet suburban home that had remained structurally frozen in time since the night the glass of ice water had melted on the kitchen counter. The neighborhood around her was populated by strangers now, young families who had moved from the Bay Area for cheaper housing, people who looked at her quiet, weathered house with a mild, aesthetic disapproval, completely unaware that the ground beneath their pristine lawns had once vibrated with the sirens of a capital kidnapping investigation. The emotional geography of the house became an unnavigable labyrinth of unspoken trauma, a space where every floorboard creak, every shadow thrown by the backyard willow tree, and every rhythmic hum of the old refrigerator was an echo of a violent bass line that had never been corrected by an arrest or a trial. The older sister couldn't bring herself to sell the property, driven by a deep, irrational terror that if she walked away, if she painted over the faded wallpaper or replaced the old brass light fixtures, she would be finalized as an accomplice to the erasure of her sister's existence on Earth. Instead, she stayed, her own youth slipping away through her fingers as she worked a quiet, administrative job that allowed her to return to the empty house before the dusk could settle over the street, her routine a mirrored reflection of the defensive habits her father had beaten into her during the terrifying aftermath of 1991. She locked the deadbolts the very second she stepped inside. She checked the window latches in a specific, 3-step ritual every night before bed, and she kept a baseball bat by her nightstand, her mind constantly projecting into the dark, simulating the sudden, silent breach that had stolen her sister without creating a single ripple in the neighborhood pool. The local police department had long since dismantled the cold case task force due to budget constraints and the relentless, daily pressure of modern narcotics and gang violence, leaving her with the absolute, crushing realization that if the truth were ever to be found, it would not come from a laboratory, a database, or a sudden, conscience-stricken midnight phone call to the sheriff's tip line. The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic flourish of law enforcement intervention. It began with a structural necessity, a mundane household failure that occurred in the sweltering heat of August 2024, when a severe leak in the master bathroom ceiling forced the older sister to confront the one area of the home that had remained completely untouched since the day of the abduction, the deep, unlit cavern of the attic. The attic was a space of absolute avoidance, a zone that her parents had sealed off with heavy plywood and padlocks shortly after the disappearance, treating it as a tomb for the items that were too agonizing to look at but too sacred to destroy, a repository for her sister's childhood clothes, school art projects, and the remaining fragments of a life that had been violently truncated. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, her hands shaking with a mixture of physical exertion and a creeping, ancestral dread, she broke the rusted lock on the ceiling hatch, pulled down the creaking wooden ladder, and climbed up into the stifling, 100-degree heat of the insulation-dusted rafters. The air up there was thick, tasting of dry rot, old dust, and 33 years of trapped, stagnant summer heat, the low beams forcing her to crawl on her knees through the gray fiberglass batting while her flashlight beam cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating a row of moldering cardboard boxes piled against the brick chimney. As she dragged the first box into the center of the crawlspace, the tape splitting with a dry, paper rasp under her fingers, she found herself looking at a time capsule of 1991, faded neon windbreakers, cassette tapes of high school garage bands, and sketchbooks filled with her sister's charcoal drawings of human hands and surreal, dark landscapes that looked shockingly prophetic in the dim light of the attic. But as she reached the bottom of the third box, hidden beneath a layer of old track meet ribbons and high school newspapers, her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong to her sister's world, a heavy, cold object wrapped in an oily rags that sat in the corner of the cardboard container, like a venomous insect waiting to be unearthed. She carefully peeled back the rotting fabric, her heart striking against her ribs with a slow, heavy rhythm that turned the hot air in her lungs to ice, revealing a vintage, analog video camera, a heavy Panasonic camcorder from the late 1980s, its plastic casing scratched and coated in a thin layer of long-dead grease, a piece of high-end equipment that her family could never have afforded during those lean, working-class years. Next to the camera lay a stack of 5 unmarked VHS-C tapes, their plastic shells pristine, their small windows revealing tightly wound magnetic ribbons that held their secrets locked away behind a barrier of decades of silence, a collection of data that had been deliberately obscured from the eyes of the police during the initial, frantic sweep of the home. The discovery of the camera and the tapes inside the sealed attic was a physical shock that instantly shattered the older sister's understanding of her family's past, triggering a terrifying wave of cognitive dissonance that forced her to question who had put them there, why they had been hidden behind padlocks, and what kind of truth had been lurking just inches above her head while she slept through 33 years of unresolved grief. She crawled out of the hatch, her clothes covered in gray insulation dust, her face pale, carrying the heavy plastic camera and the small tapes down into the living room like a woman carrying an unexploded shell from a long-forgotten war. The analog world had returned to collect its debt, and she knew that she could not go to the police yet, not until she knew what was on those ribbons, not until she understood if the secret buried in her attic was a key to her sister's rescue or a definitive, crushing documentation of her execution. She spent the next 48 hours searching online for a working converter, a digital deck that could translate the obsolete magnetic signal of 1991 into a modern format, her mind operating with a frantic, dawn-dap velocity that left no room for sleep, food, or rational hesitation, driven by a primal, sisterly necessity to force the dark to surrender its image. When the digital transfer equipment arrived, she set it up on the kitchen table under the harsh glare of the overhead LED lights, the small converter box looking like a clinical piece of medical equipment designed to resurrect a corpse from the archives of the valley. She inserted the first tape into the slot, the mechanical clunk of the deck echoing through the quiet house like a gunshot, the monitor screen flickering with a static-heavy blue line before the magnetic tracking clicked into place, clearing the screen to reveal a grainy, time-stamped recording from May 14, 1991, the exact date of her sister's disappearance. The video was shot from a low angle, shaky and handheld, looking through the windshield of a car parked across the street from their suburban home. The lens zoomed in on the front door and the wide living room window where the silhouette of her 16-year-old sister could be seen moving past the television screen. It wasn't a family home movie. It was a surveillance tape, a calculated, methodical documentation of her sister's daily movements, a predator's blueprint captured in high-contrast analog video that proved the abduction hadn't been a random act of opportunity, but the final, explosive phase of a long-term stalking operation that had taken place in the bright glare of the suburban sun. The older sister sat completely motionless, her breath caught in her throat, her fingers digging into the edge of the kitchen table as the tape continued to play, revealing hours of footage from different dates leading up to the disappearance, recordings of her sister walking home from the track meet, sitting on a bench at the park, and even sleeping through her bedroom window from the vantage point of the backyard tree line. The horror of the realization was a physical weight that turned her stomach to pure ice. The camera had been inside her attic, hidden by someone who had access to the house, someone who knew how to bypass the locks, someone who had sat in the dark rafters above her bedroom while the family rotted away from grief. She inserted the final tape into the deck, her body shaking so violently she could barely align the plastic edges with the slot, her mind praying for a face, a reflection, or a single clue that could break the structural anonymity of the monster who had written the script for her life's tragedy. The screen flickered, the static hissed through the speakers, and then, as the tracking stabilized, the camera panned down inside the car, revealing the driver's hands resting on the steering wheel, large, weathered hands wearing a distinct, heavy gold signet ring with a cracked onyx stone, a piece of jewelry that she recognized instantly. A ring that had belonged to the one person the family had trusted implicitly to protect them from the dark. The kitchen table became the epicenter of a historical earthquake, the cold blue light from the digital monitor reflecting off the older sister's pale, sweat-streaked face as the final seconds of the 1991 magnetic tape hissed to a silent, black finish. The image of the gold signet ring with its cracked onyx stone remained burned into her retinas like a chemical scar, a piece of jewelry she had seen 1,000 times over family dinners, at backyard barbecues, and during the hollow, crying wakes that had followed her father's death. It belonged to Uncle Arthur, her father's older brother, the rock of the family, the man who had stayed at the house for 3 solid weeks after the disappearance to handle the police, cook the meals, and filter the anonymous tips that flooded the landline phone. The realization was a sickening, physical violence that turned the very structure of her memories into a house of lies. The predator hadn't been an anonymous ghost drifting through the valley. He had been the architect of their survival, the custodian of their grief, a monster who had comforted the mother while the daughter's school portrait grew faded under the glare of the living room lamps. The cognitive dissonance was a heavy, suffocating pressure that made it difficult for her to draw breath in the quiet house, forcing her to confront a past that was suddenly rewritten in lines of calculated malice and systematic deception. She looked up at the ceiling hatch, the dark opening to the attic staring down at her like an open mouth, realizing that Uncle Arthur had volunteered to install the plywood insulation and the heavy padlocks in the summer of 1991, claiming he wanted to save her parents the agony of looking at the missing girl's belongings. It had been the perfect concealment strategy, an absolute, brilliant subversion of forensic logic. He hadn't hidden the evidence of his stalking operation in a shallow grave or a remote storage locker where a random search could unearth it. He had sealed it directly inside the victim's own home, knowing the family would treat the space as a sacred tomb, an area of permanent avoidance that would never be disturbed as long as the grief remained active. He had used their own sorrow as a concrete vault to protect the tools of his crime. Living less than 20 miles away in a pristine retirement community near Roseville, his reputation as a devoted family man entirely untarnished by the passage of 33 long years. She spent the remaining hours of the night in a state of high intensity, Dawn dap paralysis, her mind moving with the frantic velocity of a cornered animal as she tried to determine her next move, knowing that she could not simply pick up the phone and call the local sheriff's department. The original case file was ancient. The detectives who had understood the nuances of the 1991 investigation were either dead or long retired, and Uncle Arthur was a powerful, respected figure in the regional construction unions, a man whose connections reached deep into the municipal structures of the county. If she moved too quickly, if she showed her hand before the legal framework was entirely airtight, the evidence could be dismissed as contaminated, or Arthur could find a way to destroy whatever secondary material remained hidden in his own properties before a warrant could be signed. She packed the Panasonic camcorder, the small VHS-C tapes, and the digital converter deck into a heavy leather duffel bag, her hands shaking so violently she had to use her teeth to tear the packing tape she used to seal the interior compartments, her every instinct screaming that the house was no longer safe, that the walls themselves were infected by the presence of a secret above. At exactly 7:30 a.m., she pulled her car out of the driveway into the bright, indifferent glare of the morning sun, her eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror, checking every sedan and utility truck that trailed behind her as she drove toward downtown Sacramento to find the one person who could handle the explosive weight of what she had discovered. She bypassed the main precinct, navigating instead to a small, private legal annex near the state capitol building where a retired homicide captain named Marcus Vance maintained a quiet consultancy practice, a man who had spent the final 10 years of his active service trying to break the stalemate of the 1991 disappearance before budget cuts, had dismantled his unit. Vance was an analog relic in a digital world, his office smelling of old tobacco, paper binders, and floor wax, his desk covered in typed transcripts and historical street maps of Sacramento County that dated back to an era before the orange groves had been replaced by the master plan developments. When she walked into his office without an appointment, her face gray from sleep deprivation, her fingers clutching the straps of the duffel bag with a white-knuckled rigidity, Vance didn't ask for her name. He looked at her eyes, recognized the ancestral trauma of the 1991 file staring back at him, and silently closed the frosted glass door to the hallway. The presentation of the tapes inside the private office was a somber, clinical operation. Vance set up an old CRT monitor he kept in the corner for reviewing archival police training videos, his movements slow and methodical as he connected the digital lines and slid the first magnetic ribbon into the deck. As the grainy surveillance footage of the 16-year-old girl walking home from the track meet flickered across the screen, the timestamp illuminating her final hours in a digital green glow, the retired captain's posture went completely rigid, his hand freezing on his coffee mug as his mind instantly recalibrated 33 years of professional frustration. He didn't speak while the hours of footage played out, his eyes locked on the low-angle perspective, the zooming mechanics of the lens, and the calculated tracking of the family home, immediately identifying the behavioral pattern of an organized, methodical stalker who was operating with an unrestricted level of access to the perimeter. But when the final tape reached the pan down inside the vehicle, revealing the large construction hand resting on the steering wheel and the distinct gold signet ring with the cracked black stone, Vance let out a low, breathy curse that sounded like a physical deflation of his chest. "Arthur Lee," Vance whispered, his voice a dry, rasping rumble that carried the weight of a decade of unresolved investigations straight into the quiet air of the room. "I interviewed him 3 times in June of '91. He was the one who gave us the timeline for the track meet. He was the one who organized the volunteer searches along the American River, and he was the one who kept telling the field teams that he had seen a suspicious blue sedan cruising the perimeter the day before she vanished. He didn't just lie to us. He directed the entire apparatus of the early search away from his own shadow, using his status as a grieving uncle to sit inside our command post, learning exactly what boundaries our search dogs were covering so he could stay 3 steps ahead of the net." The retrospective realization was a bitter, chemical poison in the retired captain's mouth. He stood up, his joints popping against the silence of the office, looking at the duffel bag on his desk as if it were a high-explosive device that had been pulled from the mud of a long-forgotten battlefield. The legal strategy required to transform the discovery in the attic into a definitive, capital arrest operation was a complex maze of jurisdictional boundaries and forensic validation protocols that had to be executed with total, surgical secrecy to prevent a leak from tipping off the target. Vance picked up his landline phone, his fingers dialing a secure, private number that bypassed the standard administrative switchboards of the county sheriff's department, reaching out to a current assistant district attorney who had specialized in the prosecution of historical homicides through advanced scientific methodology. Within 2 hours, the small office was transformed into a high-intensity war room, the windows covered by the blinds, the conference table stacked with the original, dust-faded 1991 boxes that had been quietly retrieved from the evidence vaults under the cover of a routine archiving audit. The team was composed of the older sister, the retired captain, the prosecutor, and a young digital forensics technician who was brought in to establish the pristine, unbroken chain of custody for the Panasonic camcorder and the magnetic ribbons before any formal warrants could be signed by a superior court judge. The technician worked with gloved hands, using microbrushes and specialized lighting arrays to scan the exterior of the video camera and the plastic cassettes for any latent biological material or ancient fingerprint patterns that might have survived 33 years of exposure to the extreme heat cycles of the attic rafters. While the analog equipment was being digitized frame by frame on a high-speed workstation, the prosecutor reviewed the original 1991 statements, finding that Arthur's alibi, that he had been working on a commercial roof installation in Roseville at the time of the abduction, had been verified only by a handwritten time card that he had filled out himself as the site foreman. The lack of independent verification had been overlooked during the initial, frantic sweep of the investigation because the police had been entirely focused on transient drifters, local teenagers, and the suspicious vehicles reported by the family's neighbors. Reports that they now realized had been systematically manufactured and fed to the tip line by Arthur himself to generate a permanent cloud of digital static around his own trajectory. The horror of the realization became even more acute when the digital forensics workstation completed the high-definition enhancement of the audio track hidden beneath the static hiss of the magnetic ribbons, revealing a low, rhythmic ambient sound that had been captured by the camcorder's internal microphone during the surveillance of the home. It wasn't just the engine hum of a car. It was the distinct, syncopated ticking of an antique grandfather clock that had sat in the entryway of Arthur's own residence in 1991, an acoustic signature that proved several of the recordings hadn't been shot from a vehicle across the street, but had been filmed from an interior vantage point within his own home. Using a high-powered telephoto lens to monitor the girl's bedroom from across the narrow canyon that separated their properties. The trap was tightening, the abstract myth of the California cold case collapsing inward into a cold, clinical edifice of geometric coordinates, acoustic science, and biological data that left the gray-haired union foreman completely exposed to the light of a modern legal execution. By midnight, the assistant district attorney had finalized the paperwork for a comprehensive, multi-tiered search and arrest warrant, a document that charged Arthur Lee with first-degree kidnapping, capital assault, and homicide under special circumstances, based on the newly discovered surveillance evidence and the fraudulent statements he had entered into the historical police record. The signature was obtained from a judge who had been a young defense attorney in Sacramento during the 90s, his expression one of absolute, cold disbelief as he pressed the official state seal into the parchment, signaling the end of the waiting and the beginning of the tactical mobilization. The older sister sat in the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on the bright yellow string that the technician used to bind the evidence cases, realizing that the long, dark winter of her family's tragedy was about to reach its final, explosive climax, not through a sudden stroke of luck, but through the silent, patient testimony of the things her parents had padlocked above her head 33 years ago. The clock on the wall struck 2 a.m., the air inside the annex thick with the scent of ozone and paper ink as the field teams began to assemble in the lower garage, their blacked-out vehicles idling in the dark, ready to close the 33-year distance between the monster and the light of justice. The lower garage of the downtown legal annex was a cavern of concrete and exhaust fumes, a subterranean staging ground where the silence was broken only by the low, mechanical idle of 4 blacked-out utility vehicles and the metallic click of tactical gear being adjusted in the dim, overhead light. The time was 4:15 a.m., that specific, freezing hour of the California morning when the air tastes of sulfur, dew, and cold river water. A window of maximum vulnerability before the first commuters began to choke the suburban arteries of Sacramento County. A team of 8 county deputies, accompanied by 2 state investigators and Captain Vance, stood around the hood of a lead SUV, their faces illuminated by the pale green glow of a rugged tablet displaying the architectural layout of Arthur Lee's retirement property in Roseville. The objective was a surgical, high-velocity breach. They were moving to secure a 74-year-old man who had spent 33 years believing that the locks on his attic and the passage of generations had granted him a permanent immunity from the blood on his hands. The approach to the target location was a ghostly, disciplined procession that snaked through the high-end residential developments of Placer County, a landscape of master-planned cul-de-sacs, artificial lakes, and pristine stucco villas that looked like a monument to corporate prosperity. There were no sirens, no flashing lights to announce the arrival of the state's moral fury. The vehicles moved with a calculated, predatory silence, their headlights extinguished as they coasted down the manicured street to park along the curb just 3 houses away from Arthur's driveway. The home was a fortress of mundane luxury, a single-story layout with a perfectly manicured lawn, a late-model luxury sedan parked under the security lights, and a row of decorative palms that stood motionless in the early morning damp. The contrast between this display of peaceful, successful retirement and the grainy, high-contrast images of the 1991 surveillance tapes was a sickening weight in the chests of the operators who stepped out of the vans, their boots making no sound against the damp asphalt of the gutter. The tactical team split into 2 elements, one moving with fluid, mechanical precision to secure the rear perimeter and the glass patio doors, while the primary stack assembled at the front portico, their heavy dynamic entry tools held low against their vests. Captain Vance stood just behind the lead shield, his hand on his service weapon, his breathing slow and rhythmic as his mind flashed back to the June days of 1991 when he had sat across from this exact man in a room that smelled of carbon paper and stale coffee, listening to him spin an intricate, protective web of false timelines and manufactured suspects. The betrayal wasn't an abstract legal construct. It was a physical stain on his entire career, a realization that the law had been used as an accomplice to its own defeat by a man who had used the intimacy of family ties to monitor the progress of Annette. The commander raised 3 fingers, then 2, then 1, and then the morning stillness was violently shattered by the explosive, metallic crunch of the front door frame being driven inward by a hydraulic ram. The breach was an absolute, kinetic intrusion that tore the peaceful veneer off the residence in a fraction of a second, the commands of the team echoing through the high plaster ceilings like a succession of thunderclaps as they moved through the entryway, their weapon lights cutting through the darkness of the interior. Sheriff's Department. Search warrant. Get on the ground, the voices boomed, a synchronized wall of sound designed to paralyze the target's psychological capacity to resist or access the firearms he kept registered to his name. They bypassed the formal living room, moving down the wide hallway past an antique grandfather clock that ticked with the exact, syncopated rhythm that had been decoded from the audio track of the attic tapes, its mechanical heartbeat a chilling, historical confirmation that they were standing in the very center of the monster's workspace. They found Arthur Lee in the master bedroom, a man caught between the heavy sleep of old age and the terrifying realization that his 33-year run had reached its terminal point, his frame looking remarkably small and vulnerable beneath the white down comforter of his king-sized bed. He didn't scream, he didn't fight, he didn't attempt to reach for the bedside drawer. He sat up slowly, his gray hair wild, his chest heaving under a white undershirt, his eyes blinking rapidly against the intense, blinding glare of the tactical flashlights that pinned him to the mattress. As the deputies moved in to secure his wrists with heavy zip ties, the metallic clink of the cuffs was a clean, definitive punctuation mark that brought the long, dark winter of the 1991 cold case to a sudden and irreversible conclusion in the early morning light. Arthur Lee, you are under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of your niece, the lead investigator stated, his voice a low, clinical rumble that filled the bedroom with the unbribable weight of a judicial execution, stripping the suspect of his civilian status, his union prestige, and his grandfatherly mask in a matter of seconds. Arthur didn't look at the warrant that was laid on the nightstand. His gaze traveled past the deputies to find Captain Vance standing in the doorway, his face a mask of stone-cold professional judgment that offered no room for negotiation, no space for family alignment, and no mercy for the secrets of the past. The suspect's jaw worked silently for a moment, his throat clicking in the quiet room, a sudden, old man weariness settling over his features as he realized that the technology of the future and the persistence of his own family had finally converged to tear his world down to the bedrock. "I knew when her mother died that the house wouldn't stay closed forever," Arthur whispered, his voice a dry, rasping murmur that carried the thick, stagnant heat of that 1991 summer straight into the sterile air of the modern bedroom, a confession that dropped into the space like a physical weight. "The girls always wanted to change things, paint the walls, open the hatches. I thought if I put the padlocks on, they'd treat it like a shrine, leave the boxes alone until the city paved the whole valley over. You think you can bury a choice under 30 years of ordinary days, Marcus, but the ground gets soft when you get old, and the dark has a habit of finding its way back to your porch." The admission was a shockwave that hit the team with the force of a physical blow, an unredacted confirmation that the phantom was real, that the recovery operation was about to begin, and that the narrative of the town's greatest tragedy was about to expand into a horrifying landscape of calculated malice. While Arthur was being loaded into the rear of an armored transport vehicle, his legs bound by heavy transport chains that dragged with a sharp, heavy cadence against the concrete of the driveway, a separate team of state forensic analysts moved into the residence to execute the comprehensive search warrant, turning the pristine suburban villa into a high-intensity forensic excavation zone. They weren't just looking for records. They were searching for the secondary repository, the hidden trophies, and the definitive physical evidence that a methodical, organized stalker like Arthur would inevitably retain to fuel his internal fantasy life across decades of conformity. They scoured his workshop in the garage, his digital files, and the small, locked safe hidden beneath the floorboards of his master closet, using advanced chemical reagents and multi-wavelength alternate light sources to read the hidden history of the structure. The news of the arrest broke out into the Sacramento media ether with the speed of an electric surge, the digital headlines screaming across television screens and mobile feeds before the morning traffic had even peaked on the local highways. "California Cold Case Solved. Victim's Sister Finds Truth in Attic" was the title that dominated the news cycles. The old, black-and-white high school portrait of the missing 16-year-old girl placed side by side with the grim, unmoving mugshot of the prominent union foreman who had spent 3 decades acting as the family's protector. The contrast was a profound, visceral trauma for the public. It forced a community that had built its sense of suburban safety on the assumption that the crime had been committed by a nomadic stranger to confront the reality that the killer was a structural pillar of their own society, a man who had attended community board meetings and mowed his lawn with a robotic, terrifying normalcy. Inside the legal annex downtown, the older sister sat by the window, her phone buzzing continuously with unanswered text messages and calls from distant relatives, journalists, and old neighbors who were frantically seeking an explanation for the collapse of her family's biography. She didn't pick up. Her focus was fixed on the small, silver converter deck that still sat on the conference table, the device that had allowed her sister's voice and the image of the gold signet ring to step out of the magnetic darkness of 1991 to claim their justice. She knew that the arrest was merely the first phase of a larger, more harrowing legal siege, a process that would force her to sit in a public courtroom, looking directly into the deep-set, gray eyes of her own uncle while the state's attorneys laid out the clinical, forensic reconstruction of how her family's life had been systematically hollowed out from the inside. The supervisor of the state's capital crimes unit arrived at the annex by midday, his arms full of fresh operational binders that bore the official seal of the state attorney general's office, his face showing the intense, high-functioning exhaustion of a prosecutor who recognized that he was holding the most significant file in the history of the county. He sat down across from the older sister and Captain Vance, his movements deliberate and calm, establishing a professional, clinical intimacy that was the only defense against the radioactive intensity of the facts they were processing. The indictment is airtight, the prosecutor stated, laying out the fresh signature pages under the desk lamp. "We have the original surveillance footage with a physical identification of the signet ring. We have the acoustic match for the grandfather clock from his home in '91, and the forensics team in Roseville has just recovered a secondary hidden compartment in his workbench containing the victim's original silver track meat medals and her missing house keys." He didn't just kill her, Marcus. He kept her life locked in his garage like a collection of tools. The presentation of the physical evidence was a series of devastating hammer strikes that turned the air in the room to ice. It proved that Arthur's performance as a grieving, supportive relative had been a calculated, multi-decade strategy designed to keep his own shadow from being scrutinized by the early task force. He had used his proximity to the family to learn exactly which fields our search teams were clearing. He had used his status to guide the police away from his own property line, and he had hidden the primary stalking materials inside the victim's own attic because he knew that human grief would treat the space as a tomb, an area of permanent avoidance that would never be disturbed as long as the memory remained raw. The absolute cowardice of a strategy was a psychological horror that made the skin crawl, a realization that the barrier between suburban normalcy and absolute monstrosity is nothing more than a thin, fragile thread of human choice that can be maintained with total efficiency across half a lifetime. As the team prepared for the formal arraignment hearing scheduled for the following morning, the older sister stood up and walked to the edge of the conference room window, looking down at the crowded streets of downtown Sacramento, where the evening traffic was crawling through the neon glare of the modern office complexes. The town was moving forward. The old orange groves of 1991 were long gone, paved over by millions of tons of corporate concrete, but the truth that had been locked above her bedroom for 33 years was now a living, breathing reality from which there was no longer any escape for the predator. The long, agonizing winter of her family's mystery was finally dissolving into a sharp, blinding light of accountability, a process that would force the town to look directly into its own past and rewrite its biography in the cold, unyielding lines of a capital murder prosecution. She checked her watch, adjusted her coat, and looked back at Captain Vance, their eyes meeting in a silent, profound understanding that the hunt was over, the ghost was captured, and the final, explosive battle for her sister's memory was only just beginning in the bright glare of the courtroom. The morning of the formal arraignment arrived under a heavy, monochrome canopy of Central Valley Tule fog, a dense, choking moisture that rolled off the Sacramento River and swallowed the downtown skyscrapers in a cold, featureless, white wall. Long before the courtroom doors were unlocked, the concrete plaza outside the main judicial complex was transformed into a high-intensity media encampment, with technical vans line of sight aligned to local broadcast towers, their thick cables snaking across the slick pavement like black veins. Inside the secure holding corridor beneath the building, the air was entirely clear of the external damp, smelling instead of heavy floor wax, industrial detergent, and the thin, metallic static of automated prison gates cycling through their mechanical locks. Arthur Lee sat on a reinforced plastic bench, his wrists secured to a heavy leather transport belt that pulled his posture forward, the vivid crimson jumpsuit of the administrative segregation wing accentuating the stark, paper-white paleness of his weathered skin. He didn't look like a grandfather who had spent his retirement gardening in Roseville. He looked like an artifact of a bygone era, a phantom from 1991 that had been violently dragged into the harsh, digital glare of a modern judicial reckoning. The transition from a highly respected union foreman to a capital murder suspect was a process of rapid, structural decompression that seemed to have age-accelerated his physical frame in a matter of 24 hours, his jaw resting slackly against his chest, his breathing a shallow, dry rattle that vibrated through the quiet corridor. The lead prosecutor and Captain Vance stood outside the heavy iron bars of the holding cell, their eyes fixed on the suspect's hands, those large, callous construction hands that had once held the keys to the county's most agonizing mystery. The local news tickers across the state were already vibrating with the dawn-dap rhythm of the breaking coverage. The title, California Cold Case Solved. Victim's sister finds truth in attic flashing across millions of screens, forcing a generation that had normalized the old horror to look directly into the eyes of a betrayal that defied the boundaries of human comprehension. The public wasn't just shocked. They were experiencing a profound, retrospective vertigo as they realized that the man who had carried the casket at the father's funeral was the very individual who had engineered the family's 33-year nightmare. Inside the courtroom, the gallery was a packed, breathless sea of human anticipation, the air warm and thick with the scent of damp trench coats, old paper, and the sharp, chemical charge of collective adrenaline. The victim's older sister sat in the front row, her position directly behind the prosecution table, ensuring that she would be the first thing her uncle saw when he was led through the security door by the armed bailiffs. She sat with a white-knuckled rigidity, her fingers interlaced so tightly that her joints were completely bloodless, her eyes fixed on the empty defense table where the legal team for the state was already arranging the multi-layered binders of physical evidence. Next to her sat Captain Vance, his presence a silent, immovable anchor for a family that had been hollowed out by decades of systemic deception, his face an unreadable mask of professional judgment that had been forged in the dark archives of the 1991 task force. When the side door finally clicked open, the sound of the suspect's leg irons dragging across the polished hardwood floor was a sharp, distinct crack that cut through the room like a physical blow, instantly silencing the residual whispers of the crowd and bringing the entire chamber into a singular, agonizing focus. Arthur didn't look at the media galleries, nor did he look at the sketch artists who were already tracing his withered profile with furious, scratching strokes of their charcoal pencils. His head remained bowed, his gaze fixed on the floorboards as he was guided to a seat next to the public defender. The contrast between his ordinary appearance, the wire-rimmed reading glasses, the gray hair combed neatly to the side, and the absolute monstrosity of the evidence locked inside the prosecution's files was a psychological horror that made the skin of the jurors crawl, a realization that evil does not wear a uniform, that it utilizes the gray fabric of daily normalcy to hide the blood on its fingers. The judge entered with a swift, authoritative rustle of his black robes, his face a grim, unyielding expression of judicial gravity that left no room for theatrical displays or rhetorical grandstanding from either side of the well. The clerk stepped to the microphone, her voice a flat, clinical drone that instantly stripped the case of its mythological status, reading the official charges into the record with a cold, metric precision that turned the 33-year tragedy into a series of legally binding descriptions of capital violence. State of California versus Arthur Lee Vance, she read, the suspect's full historical name echoing off the high plaster ceilings of the room like a succession of hammer strikes against his survival. Count 1. First-degree kidnapping of a minor with special circumstances. Count 2. Capital assault with a deadly weapon. Count 3. Homicide with premeditation and calculated concealment. The suspect stood up to enter his plea, his frame supported heavily by the edge of the defense table, his voice when he spoke a thin, rasping whisper that barely carried to the microphone, the sound of a gate opening after decades of rust and institutional neglect. Not guilty, he murmured, the words dropping into the packed room like small, useless stones against a rising tide, a predictable, procedural lie that was required to activate the complex legal machinery of a capital prosecution. The public defender immediately rose to address the court, his voice carrying the intense, strained energy of an attorney who recognized that his client was standing on the absolute edge of a state execution with zero remaining shields, his every argument reduced to an appeal for bail based on the defendant's age, his lack of recent criminal history, and his deep roots in the suburban community. The assistant district attorney didn't wait for the defense to finish. She stepped to the podium with a fluid, aggressive confidence that completely dominated the physical space of the well, her presentation of the state's detention motion a masterclass in forensic destruction. She didn't use emotional hyperbole. She didn't need to, because the facts she laid out from the Roseville search warrant were a series of devastating, unbribable facts that left the defense table completely bankrupt. She projected the high-definition photographs of the hidden compartment discovered beneath the workbench in Arthur's garage onto the massive screens that lined the courtroom walls, images of the small, tarnished silver track meat medals and the rusted house keys that had been missing since the dusk of that Tuesday in May 1991. This is not a harmless grandfather who has outlived his past, Your Honor, the prosecutor stated, her voice rising to a sharp, authoritative pitch that vibrated through the hardwood benches of the gallery. This is an organized, meticulous predator who has spent 33 years maintaining a double life at the expense of his own family's sanity. He didn't just commit a capital crime in 1991. He curated it, he archived it, and he used the profound, crippling grief of the victim's parents as a concrete vault to hide his stalking materials directly above the bedroom of the girl he violently extinguished. The state requests immediate, unrestricted detention without bail until the completion of these proceedings to ensure that the integrity of the evidence and the safety of the remaining witnesses are preserved from any further manipulation. The judge didn't hesitate. His pen struck the signature line of the detention order with a sharp, definitive click that signaled the absolute collapse of the defense's opening strategy, a ruling that remanded Arthur Lee to the high-security facility under an unceasing, 24-hour suicide watch. As the bailiff stepped forward to lead the defendant back through the security door, his transport chains clinking with a heavy, rhythmic cadence against the floor, Arthur stopped for a fraction of a second, his head turning slowly toward the front row of the gallery. His deep-set, gray eyes locked for the briefest, most terrifying instant with those of his remaining niece, an exchange of glances that carried the entire, unrestricted weight of 33 years of hidden malice, stolen peace, and family betrayal before the iron door slammed shut behind him, leaving the courtroom to erupt into a sudden, chaotic roar of media movement and public release. The older sister stepped out of the courthouse into the cold, blinding mist of the Sacramento afternoon, her face completely pale, the leather straps of her bag digging into her palm with a force that she barely registered as the reporters descended upon the steps like a flock of birds. She didn't offer a soundbite. She didn't look at the lenses that zoomed in on her tears, walking down the concrete plaza with her head held high, flanked by Captain Vance, who used his physical bulk to clear a path through the jungle of microphones and flashing lights. The real war had begun. The analog secrets of 1991 had been formally digitized and entered into the state's ledger of blood, and she knew that the next stage of the investigation would force her to return to the empty house in the suburbs to watch the forensic teams tear the structure down to its foundations in search of the final, missing truth. The Thule fog continued to thicken over the valley, burying the highways and the master plan developments in a heavy, featureless dark, a reminder that while the ghost in the attic had been captured, the landscape of their collective memory was still a long way from being clean. The echo of the iron door slamming shut beneath the courthouse basement did not signify a pause in the momentum of the state's case. Instead, it triggered a secondary, far more invasive phase of the investigation that immediately redirected the spotlight from the sterile downtown courtroom back to the quiet suburban streets of Sacramento County. By mid-afternoon, the Thule fog had dissolved into a cold, driving rain that lashed against the windows of the family's old stucco house, where 3 unmarked transport vans from the state's forensic crime unit pulled up along the curb, their roof-mounted exhaust fans humming with a low, industrial vibration. The team that stepped out into the downpour was composed of specialized skeletal recovery experts, structural engineering analysts, and digital search technicians, all wearing high-visibility forensic gear and carrying equipment cases designed for the total, microscopic dissection of a residential property. They were there to execute a comprehensive, secondary search warrant signed immediately following the arraignment, an operational mandate to dismantle the interior of the home to find the definitive physical trace of what had occurred after the 16-year-old girl vanished from the kitchen counter in May 1991. The victim's older sister stood under the shelter of the garage eaves, the leather duffel bag containing her sister's old sketchbooks slung over her shoulder, watching the technicians stretch thick webs of yellow police tape across the porch and around the trunk of the backyard willow tree. She had refused to stay at a hotel, driven by a raw, stubborn necessity to witness the physical excavation of her childhood home, to see the spaces where she had played, slept, and grieved turned into a clinical forensic grid under the glare of high-intensity halogen work lights. Captain Vance stood beside her, his trench coat soaked through, his eyes scanning the movement of the forensic teams as they moved boxes of equipment through the front door, his mind working with a cold, diagnostic precision of a man who knew that Arthur Lee's confession had only scratched the surface of a far more sinister logistical reality. "He didn't just leave those tapes in the attic, Sarah," Vance muttered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration against the steady drumming of the rain on the concrete. "An organized stalker like your uncle doesn't spend months documenting a girl's routine just to stop at a camera. He knew the structural blind spots of this house better than your parents did, and if he had the access to seal that hatch from the inside, he left something else behind, something that's been sitting right under your feet for 35 years. The interior of the house was systematically stripped of its domestic identity within a matter of hours, the furniture cleared from the living room, the faded floral wallpaper scraped from the hallway walls, and the old linoleum flooring in the kitchen pulled up in jagged, chemical-smelling sheets to expose the raw concrete foundation beneath. The forensic team used multi-wavelength alternate light sources and chemical reagents like luminol to map the hidden history of the surfaces, looking for any ancient biological signatures, blood microsplatters, or trace evidence that had survived the primitive cleaning methods of the early 90s. The glare of the work lights turned the rooms into a harsh, clinical theater, casting long, sharp shadows through the bare studs of the walls as the structural engineers used high-frequency ultrasound scanners to analyze the density of the plaster and the void spaces behind the baseboards. It was a brutal, industrial violation of her childhood memories, a process that stripped away the abstract myth of the cold case and replaced it with the cold, hard, and terrifying language of physical geometry and chemical data. The search centered on the narrow hallway that connected the missing girl's bedroom to the master bath, an area that the ultrasound equipment identified as having an anomalous structural void built into the dead space beneath the linen closet, a configuration that didn't match the original architectural blueprints filed with the County Building Department in 1978. The technicians moved in with specialized borescopes and small, reciprocating saws, cutting through the weathered drywall with a surgical precision that filled the air with a thick, choking cloud of white plaster dust and old wood fiber. Sarah stood in the doorway, her hand pressed against her mouth to filter the air, her heart striking against her ribs with a slow, heavy rhythm as the flashlight beams cut through the newly opened wall cavity, illuminating a hidden, custom-built storage drop lined with heavy plastic sheeting and sealed with industrial weather stripping. It was a predator's vault, a secondary cache built by Arthur Lee during his time as the primary renovation contractor for the family home in the late 80s, a structural compartment that had sat completely undetected just inches from the path the family walked every single day. The recovery from the hidden wall drop was a slow, agonizingly quiet operation, with the lead forensic analyst working with gloved hands to inventory the contents frame by frame for the digital cameras, ensuring that the chain of custody remained absolutely pristine for the upcoming capital trial. They retrieved a weathered, analog audio cassette recorder, its plastic casing coated in a thin film of long-dead grease, along with 3 small microcassettes that had been labeled with hand-drawn geometric symbols that matched the markings found on the attic videotapes. Beneath the recording equipment lay a collection of personal items that had belonged to the missing 16-year-old, her original track meat running shoes, a silver charm bracelet she had received for her 15th birthday, and a collection of handwritten notes and diary pages that had been torn from her journals before the police could secure her bedroom in May 1991. The discovery was a visceral, physical shock that turned the air in the hallway to pure ice. It proved that Arthur's intrusion into their lives hadn't been a sudden, impulsive flash of madness, but a deep, systemic campaign of total voyeurism and psychological curation that had been active for years before the final abduction. Inside the mobile command unit parked in the driveway, the digital search technicians immediately connected the recovered microcassettes to a high-fidelity diagnostic workstation, using advanced noise reduction algorithms to clear the decades of magnetic hiss from the audio tracks. Captain Vance and Sarah sat in the close, electronic warmth of the van, the monitors casting a pale blue light across their faces as the technicians stabilized the audio signal and pressed play, filling the small space with a sudden, sharp sound of a tape deck clicking into place. The audio that emerged from the speakers was a psychological horror show that turned Sarah's stomach to stone. It wasn't a collection of music or radio broadcasts, but a series of secret, room ambient recordings that had been captured by hidden microphones Arthur had installed inside the girls' bedroom walls during the 1989 structural repairs. The tapes contained hours of private conversations, the sound of her sister typing her school essays, practicing her track routines, and even sleeping, her soft, rhythmic breathing echoing through the modern van with a terrifying, immediate clarity that brought the ghost of 1991 straight into the present. The horror reached a devastating crescendo on the second microcassette, which captured a recording from the evening of May 12, 1991, just 48 hours before the disappearance, revealing a quiet, muffled confrontation that had taken place inside the home while the parents were away at a union meeting in Sacramento. The audio track captured the sound of the front door deadbolt turning, followed by the heavy, distinct footsteps of Arthur Lee moving down the hallway, his voice when he spoke carrying a soft, smooth, and entirely unremorseful familiarity that made Sarah's skin crawl. "You shouldn't leave the keys in the latch, Sarah," the recorded voice murmured, the static of the tape hissing behind his words like a venomous insect. "Your mom thinks the neighborhood is safe, but the dark has a habit of slipping through the cracks when you aren't looking. I told your dad I'd check the attic vents before the rain rolls in off the Delta, but I wanted to make sure you were doing your homework first." The line was followed by the voice of her 16-year-old sister, her tone sharp, defensive, and vibrating with a low-level, instinctual panic that proved she had begun to realize that her uncle's constant, supportive presence had crossed a terrifying psychological threshold. "I didn't invite you in, Uncle Arthur," she was heard saying, her voice thin but resolute against the quiet of the empty house. "You don't need to check my bedroom vents. I told Dad that I heard someone walking in the attic last week, someone moving above my ceiling while I was studying, and he said it was just the house settling, but it wasn't. You need to leave. You need to give me back the spare key you took from the kitchen counter." The revelation dropped into the mobile command unit like an explosive shell, an absolute, historical confirmation that the victim had identified her stalker before the final blow was struck, and that Arthur had used his position of absolute family trust to silence the one voice that could have exposed his monstrosity to the world. The suspect's recorded response was a study in clinical, sociopathic control, his voice dropping to a low, soothing whisper that was far more terrifying than any scream or physical threat could ever be. "You shouldn't let your imagination run away with you, sweetheart." The tape played out, the sound of his heavy construction hand brushing against the wooden door frame audible on the microphone. "We're family. Everything I do is to make sure this house stays secure, to make sure nothing happens to you out there on those grid roads. You don't say anything to your dad about the key. It'll just worry his heart, and he's got enough to handle with the union strike. We'll keep our little secrets between us, just like we always do." The tape ended with a sharp, metallic click of the front door closing and the sound of her sister's muffled sobs echoing through the empty bedroom, leaving the investigators in the van completely drained of breath, the absolute cowardice and malice of the strategy laid bare on the digital monitor. The supervisor of the state's Capital Crimes Unit arrived at the property by dusk, his vehicle splashing through the flooded gutters as he carried a stack of fresh forensic evidence logs into the house, his expression one of grim, absolute determination. He sat down with Captain Vance at the bare kitchen counter, the pool of light from a portable work lamp illuminating the recovered silver track medals and the microcassette transcripts that lay between them like a formal sentence of death for Arthur Lee. "The defense is completely dead, Marcus," the prosecutor stated, his voice a low, hard resonance that cut through the sound of the rain lashing against the bare studs of the walls. "We don't just have a stalking case anymore. We have a verified timeline of premeditated silencing. He didn't abduct her out of a sudden, random impulse. He executed her because she found the microphones in the wall, because she realized he was the entity moving in the rafters above her head, and because she was about to destroy the mask of respectability he had spent his life constructing." The legal framework for the capital trial was now an unassailable, ironclad edifice of scientific and behavioral data that left the public defender's office with absolutely zero remaining strategies to explore, every potential avenue of doubt crushed by the voice of the victim emerging from the walls of her own home. The state attorney general's office issued an updated indictment by midnight, adding charges of aggravated tracking, witness tampering through capital violence, and first-degree burglary under special circumstances, ensuring that when the jury was finally seated, the trial would move with the dawn-dap velocity of an execution. Outside, the rain continued to pour over Sacramento County, the water rushing through the drainage canals and washing over the concrete subdivisions that had paved over the old orange groves of 1991. But inside the hollowed-out stucco house, the silence was finally being replaced by the unbribable, deafening voice of the truth, a light that had spent 35 years waiting in the dark attic to finally burn the monster down to the bone. The discovery of the hidden wall drop and the chilling acoustic archive of 1991 acted as a tectonic demolition inside the state attorney general's office, converting what had already been a formidable prosecution into a historic, unassailable legal dragnet. The news of the microcassettes recovered from the hollowed-out studs of the suburban home leaked into the Sacramento media ecosystem with the speed of an electric shock, sending a secondary wave of revulsion through a public that was already reeling from the initial details of the attic discovery. The headline, "California Cold Case Solved. Victim's Sister Finds Truth in Attic," underwent a permanent mutation on the digital news feeds, now accompanied by analytical breakdowns of a multi-year voyeuristic stalking operation that had taken place directly within the sacred boundaries of a family residence. The collective trauma of the town deepened into a hard, defensive cynicism. It was no longer just about a monstrous act committed in the heat of a long-forgotten summer, but about a systematic infiltration of a household by a predator who had utilized the very language of paternal protection to engineer a flawless, multi-decade execution of his own blood. Inside the high-security medical wing of the county jail, the psychological space around Arthur Lee was contracting with a crushing, industrial velocity that left him completely stripped of his defensive options. He sat on the edge of his steel bunk, his gray cardigan replaced by the high-visibility suicide prevention smock, his wire-rimmed glasses confiscated, leaving his deep-set, gray eyes looking blurred and unfocused as he stared at the bare concrete floor of his cell. The realization that the forensic teams had dismantled the linen closet, that they had fished out the microcassettes and decoded the voice of his 16-year-old niece from the magnetic tape, had broken the remaining structural integrity of his defiance. He had stopped eating the industrial trays provided by the guards, his body entering a rapid, physical atrophy that made his wrinkled skin hang loosely from his collarbones, a physical dissolution that mirrored the total collapse of his civilian respectability out in the bright glare of the suburban sun. He was a man who had outlived his era, a master of analog concealment who had been utterly destroyed by the unbribable, digital resurrection of his own hidden timeline. The state's legal team, led by the assistant district attorney and backed by the diagnostic expertise of Captain Marcus Vance, used the isolation of the pretrial window to construct a bulletproof presentation that would leave the public defender with zero room to manufacture a sliver of doubt. They sat around the large conference table in the downtown legal annex until the early hours of the morning, their faces illuminated by the blue light of dual-monitor setups that displayed the syncopated audio tracks of the 1991 recordings alongside the high-definition photographs of the recovered silver track medals. They were weaving the forensic genealogy, the surveillance video footage, and the acoustic signatures of the grandfather clock into a single, unbreakable rope designed to hang the defendant before a jury of his peers. The strategy was entirely devoid of emotional hyperbole or rhetorical grandstanding. The prosecutor recognized that the raw, unredacted facts of the file carried an overwhelming, calculated power that would turn the courtroom into a clinical execution chamber for Arthur Lee's defense. The public defender's office, facing a complete institutional bankruptcy, attempted a final, desperate maneuver to suppress the microcassette audio recordings, filing a motion for an emergency evidentiary hearing under the claim that the tapes were ancient, heavily degraded, and that their emotional impact on a potential jury would be unfairly prejudicial to the defendant's right to a fair trial. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, a cold, rain-lashed day that drew a packed, breathless crowd to the courthouse plaza, the lines of citizens stretching through the security scanners and into the high-arched corridors of the building. The older sister sat in her accustomed position in the front row of the gallery, her posture completely rigid, her fingers clutching the leather straps of her bag with a white-knuckled intensity that showed she had no intention of backing away from the final, public confrontation with her family's shadow. When the side door clicked open and Arthur Lee was brought in by 3 armed deputies, the heavy clinking of his transport chains against the hardwood floor was a sharp, distinct crack that froze the room in a state of absolute, immediate tension. The defense attorney stepped to the podium with a frantic, aggressive energy that betrayed the immense pressure under which his team was operating, arguing that the microcassettes were a violation of the state's wiretapping laws from 1991 and that because the victim had been a minor, the recordings could not be authenticated without a living witness to verify the context of the conversation. He gestured toward his client, attempting to highlight his physical frailty, his advanced age, and the cognitive decline that his team claimed had rendered him incapable of actively participating in his own defense. "We are asking this court to exclude these audio files from the trial record," the public defender stated, his voice echoing off the high plaster ceilings of the chamber. "The introduction of these ancient, highly enhanced ambient recordings will transform this proceeding from a trial of facts into a theatrical display of historical horror, forcing the jury to rule on emotion rather than the clear limits of the physical evidence." The assistant district attorney didn't offer a lengthy rebuttal. She walked to the digital lectern with a fluid, chilling confidence, her hand pressing a single key on the interface to activate the high-fidelity sound system that had been installed in the corners of the ceiling. The courtroom lights were automatically dimmed, the only illumination coming from the pale blue monitors of the legal teams, and then, out of the darkness, came the sudden, sharp sound of the 1991 tape tracking into place, filling the chamber with the low, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock. The voice of Arthur Lee emerged from the speakers with a terrifying, immediate clarity that made the skin of the spectators crawl, his low, soothing whisper describing the unlocked front door and the secrets he intended to keep with his 16-year-old niece. "The wiretapping laws of 1991 were designed to protect citizens from unauthorized state surveillance, Your Honor," the prosecutor stated, her voice cutting through the residual echo of the tape like a surgical strike. "They were never intended to act as a constitutional shield for a capital predator who installed hidden microphones inside the bedroom walls of a child to document his own voyeuristic stalking operation. This audio file is an unbribable, historical record of the defendant's premeditated intent to silence the one voice that could have unmasked his monstrosity to this community." The victim herself authenticates this tape. She identifies her uncle, she identifies the spare key he stole from the kitchen counter, and she establishes the absolute baseline of the malice that resulted in her violent abduction just 48 hours later. The judge didn't look down at his notes. His eyes remained fixed on the silent, gray-haired man who sat at the defense table with his head hung low, his withered profile catching the blue glare of the projection screens like a monument to a lifetime of total deception. When he brought his gavel down against the wooden block, the sharp, authoritative sound was a definitive punctuation mark that broke the structural hope of the public defender's office, a ruling that denied the motion to suppress and declared that every frame of the video footage and every second of the microcassette audio tracks would be admitted for the capital trial. The announcement triggered a sudden, chaotic rustle of movement through the gallery, several reporters scrambling toward the rear doors to relay the decision to the live broadcast trucks outside, while the older sister sat completely motionless, her face pale, a quiet, devastating sense of historical vindication washing over her features in the dim light of the room. The legal defense for Arthur Lee had collapsed to the bedrock. There were no remaining loopholes to explore, no technical ambiguities to manufacture, and no procedural shields left to throw against the wall of judicial execution that the state had built on the bones of his secrets. The supervisor of the Capital Crimes Unit stepped out of the well into the hallway, his coat slung over his arm, his expression one of grim, professional readiness as he looked out at the media jungle that packed the concrete plaza of the square. He knew that the formal jury selection would begin within 48 hours, an operation that would force 12 ordinary citizens of Sacramento County to look directly into the eyes of a neighbor who had spent 33 years performing the role of a supportive relative while carrying the trophies of a child's murder in his garage workbench. The analog world had finally run out of dark corners. The digital net had closed completely around the target, and the town outside was settling into the evening rain, entirely unaware that the loudest, most historic chapter of their shared biography was now locked into the state's ledger of blood, waiting for the first opening statement to burn the monster down to the bone. The formal seating of the jury for State of California versus Arthur Lee Vance converted the third-floor ceremonial courtroom into a highly pressurized ideological crucible where the historical trauma of 1991 was systematically distilled into a rigid framework of modern judicial architecture. Out in the concrete plaza of downtown Sacramento, the rain had settled into a low, pervasive drizzle that blanketed the city in a gray, industrial damp, but inside the chamber, the atmosphere was supercharged with the intense, chemical heat of hundreds of citizens waiting to be screened by the adversarial mechanics of the well. The public defender's office moved through the selection process with a frantic, protective aggression, desperate to identify and eliminate any potential juror whose eyes narrowed when they looked at the gray-haired defendant, or whose voice betrayed a deep-seated, generational connection to the panic that had locked the Valley's doors 35 years ago. They were fighting an institutional rearguard action against an avalanche of scientific and acoustic data, realizing that their only remaining hope lay in finding a faction of the jury that could be seduced by the philosophical separation of the fragile, 74-year-old grandfather from the meticulous predator of the analog era. The assistant district attorney and Captain Marcus Vance sat at the prosecution table with total, monolithic composure, their physical layout defined by the neat, multi-tiered stacks of black operational binders that contain the high-definition transcriptions of the recovered microcassettes and the structural diagrams of the linen closet drop. They didn't engage in the performative theatricality of the jury selection. They let the weight of the file speak for itself, watching with a quiet, diagnostic precision as candidate after candidate collapsed under the psychological pressure of Arthur's proximity. The process was a slow, agonizing excavation of the town's collective biography, forcing ordinary citizens, many of whom had been children themselves during the summer of the abduction, to vocalize the latent, unresolved terror that had dictated where they could ride their bikes and how late they could remain on the street after the sun dipped below the tree line. By the time the final alternate was sworn in on Thursday afternoon, the room had been completely purged of its bureaucratic neutrality, the 12 individuals in the box sitting with a tight, somber rigidity that reflected their awareness that they had been drafted to write the definitive, final chapter of a multi-generational tragedy. The following Monday morning, the high geometric windows of the courtroom were completely frosted with condensation as the bailiffs cleared the main corridor and allowed the public to fill the gallery for the official commencement of the state's forensic presentation. The room was packed to its absolute capacity, the air heavy with the scent of wet wool, damp umbrellas, and the distinct, ozone-like static of a historical reckoning that was 35 years in the making. The victim's older sister sat in her permanent position in the front row, her posture straight, her jaw set with a cold, diamond-like rigidity that showed she had no intention of looking away from the man who had stolen her future and engineered the systematic erasure of her family's peace. When the side door clicked open and Arthur Lee was guided into the well, the sharp, heavy clanking of his leg irons against the polished wood floor was a metallic execution notice that cut through the room like a physical blow, forcing every person present to hold their breath as the defendant took his seat next to his public defender, without looking at the gallery or the prosecutors. The state attorney stepped to the podium for her opening statement on the forensic phase, her movements fluid and entirely devoid of hesitation, her voice a low, commanding resonance that instantly brought the entire chamber into the sharp, unredacted focus of her narrative. She didn't use emotional hyperbole. She didn't need to, because the facts she laid out from the secondary search of the family residence were a series of devastating, calculated hammer strikes that left the defense table completely bankrupted. She utilized the large digital projection screens to display the architectural blueprints of the suburban home from 1978, comparing them side by side with the high-frequency ultrasound scans that had identified the anomalous structural void built into the dead space beneath the linen closet. The images of the bare wall studs and the custom-built storage drop were a profound, physical shock to the jury, who watched as the clinical language of structural engineering stripped away the abstract myth of the cold case and replaced it with the terrifying reality of a domestic stalking operation. For 35 years, gentlemen of the jury, The prosecutor stated, her pointer tracing the hidden wall cavity with a slow, mechanical movement that echoed the precision of the crime itself. The defendant maintained a secret vault of voyeurism directly within the sacred boundaries of his own family's residence. He didn't just abduct his niece on that Tuesday evening in May 1991. He curated her life. He documented her private conversations through hidden microphones installed during the structural renovations of 1989, and he used the profound, crippling grief of her parents as a concrete shield to protect his trophies from the eyes of the law. He hid her missing track meet running shoes, her silver charm bracelet, and the very microcassettes that captured her final pleas for privacy just inches from the path her sister walked every single day in that hallway. The prosecution's first witness for the digital validation phase was the senior audio forensics engineer from the state's Technical Crimes Unit, a precise, unemotional man who took the stand with a digital workstation interface connected to the courtroom's high-fidelity sound system. He explained the methodology used to transfer the obsolete magnetic signals from the recovered microcassettes into a modern, uncompressed digital architecture, using multi-layered noise reduction algorithms to filter out the 35 years of background hiss without altering the organic frequency response of the voices hidden beneath. He demonstrated how the acoustic metrics of the recording confirmed that the microphones had been hardwired directly into the home's electrical infrastructure, an advanced, highly permanent installation that proved a level of premeditation and situational control that completely destroyed the defense's attempt to portray the abduction as a sudden, random flash of temporary madness. The technician then activated the audio interface, ordering the bailiff to dim the courtroom lights until the room was illuminated only by the pale blue glare of the projection screens, creating an intense, cinematic intimacy that turned the theater of justice into a time capsule of 1991. The sound of the tape tracking into place emerged from the ceiling speakers with a sudden, mechanical clunk, followed by the slow, syncopated ticking of an antique grandfather clock that filled the room with a chilling, rhythmic heartbeat. It was the exact acoustic signature that Captain Vance had identified from Arthur Lee's residence, a unique internal resonance that proved several of the recordings had been monitored and archived from his own desk across the canyon, turning his personal property into a centralized command post for the tracking of a 16-year-old child. Then, out of the high-fidelity sound field, came the voice of the victim herself, her voice thin, vibrant, and vibrating with a low-level, instinctual panic that turned the blood of every spectator in the room to ice. The tape captured the muffled confrontation from May 12, 1991, just 48 hours before the disappearance, revealing the moment she had discovered her uncle standing inside her bedroom while her parents were away in Sacramento. "I didn't invite you in, Uncle Arthur," the recorded voice said, the clarity of the digital restoration making her sound as though she were standing directly in the well of the courtroom, speaking from a past that refused to remain buried in the dark attic. "You don't need to check my bedroom vents. I told Dad that I heard someone walking in the rafters above my ceiling last week, someone moving above my head while I was studying, and he said it was just the house settling, but it wasn't. You need to leave. You need to give me back the spare key you took from the kitchen counter." The response of the defendant, captured by his own hidden wall microphones, was a study in clinical, sociopathic control that made the skin of the jurors crawl, his voice dropping to a low, soothing whisper that carried a terrifying, unrestricted malice beneath its veneer of family affection. "You shouldn't let your imagination run away with you, sweetheart," the recorded voice murmured from the speakers, the sound of his heavy construction hand brushing against the wooden door frame audible on the track. "We're family. Everything I do is to make sure this house stays secure, to make sure nothing happens to you out there on those grid roads. You don't say anything to your dad about the key. It'll just worry his heart, and he's got enough to handle with a union strike. We'll keep our little secrets between us, just like we always do." The older sister covered her face with her hands in the front row, her body shaking with a quiet, devastating grief that seemed to vibrate through the hardwood benches of the gallery, her tears a silent, public witness to the destruction of her family's history. Several members of the jury turned away from the empty defense table, unable to look at the living suspect who sat with his head hung low, his gray hair catching the blue light of the monitors, a man completely unmasked by the voice of the child he had silenced 35 years ago. The confession was no longer the centerpiece of the state's case. It had been relegated to a secondary validation tool, an administrative confirmation of a crime that had been written into the very walls of the home with a structural precision that left no room for legal maneuver or rhetorical denial. The public defender rose for his cross-examination of the audio engineer with a heavy, visible exhaustion that betrayed the total bankruptcy of his position, his voice lacking the aggressive energy he had displayed during the opening days of the jury selection. He didn't attempt to challenge the acoustic matching of the grandfather clock or dispute the identity of the voices on the tape, recognizing that any attempt to argue with the scientific reality of the recording would only serve to further alienate the jury and highlight the absolute calculation of the act. Instead, he tried to focus on the technical ambiguity of the word secrets, attempting to suggest that the conversation could be interpreted as a family dispute over boundary lines rather than a definitive, capital threat of witness elimination. It was a pathetic, empty maneuver that felt entirely weightless when contrasted with the raw terror vibrating in the victim's voice, a reminder that when the dead are allowed to speak through the tools of modern science, the strategic lies of the living have a habit of turning to dust before the gavel can even fall. When the court finally adjourned for the day, the high geometric lights of the chamber flickering back to life as the deputies stood to lead the defendant back to the transport van, the clanking of his irons was the only sound that answered the heavy, collective silence of the crowd. The supervisor of the Capital Crimes Unit stepped out of the well, his briefcase full of the day's transcripts, his face a mask of grim, professional victory as he looked at Captain Vance and Sarah standing by the exit. The multi-day siege through the analog archives of 1991 had reached its high water mark. They had successfully forced the dark to surrender its images. They had allowed the victim to claim her own justice from the walls of her room, and they had established an unassailable edifice of facts that would ensure the monster would never again walk the suburban streets of the valley. The long, agonizing winter of the Sacramento cold case was drawing to its final, definitive close. The digital net closed completely around the target, leaving the town outside to watch the slow, inevitable fall of the hammer in the bright glare of the courtroom light. The third week of the trial ground into motion under an oppressive, suffocating stillness that seemed to paralyze the very architecture of the Sacramento County Courthouse. The legal warfare of the preceding days had already established an unassailable, mathematical net of acoustic matching and forensic data around the defendant, but the state attorney had no intention of slowing the Dawn Dap velocity of her presentation. The focus of the proceedings now shifted from the clinical, digital analysis of the microcassettes to the raw, behavioral reconstruction of the days immediately following the May 1991 abduction, a phase designed to strip Arthur Lee of his remaining civilian defense and expose the calculation of his multi-decade performance. The courtroom was packed to its absolute capacity, the atmosphere heavy with the scent of ozone, stale paper, and the collective holding of breath as the prosecution prepared to call the individuals who had stood on the front lines of the initial task force. The first witness for this behavioral phase was a retired sheriff's deputy named Robert Kincaid, a man whose frame had been bent by the passage of 35 years, his eyes holding the deep, permanent weariness of an investigator who had carried the failure of the 1991 file like a physical scar into his retirement. He took the stand with a slow, deliberate cadence, his hand trembling slightly as he pressed it against the Bible to be sworn in, his gaze fixing instantly on the silent, gray-haired defendant who sat at the center of the well like a hollowed-out monument to his own deception. Kincaid spoke with a dry, matter-of-fact tone that made the historical details sound even more jarring, describing the frantic, chaotic atmosphere of the convenience store parking lot and the family home during the initial 72 hours of the search. He recounted how Arthur Lee had volunteered to act as the primary liaison between the grieving family and the precinct, positioning himself directly inside the mobile command post that the sheriff's department had established near the drainage canals of the valley. He was always there, gentlemen of the jury, Kincaid stated, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that filled the high-ceilinged chamber like a gathering storm. He didn't miss a single briefing. He brought coffee to the search teams, he helped us chart the grid maps of the American River parkways, And he was the one who consistently directed our tracking dogs away from the western boundary fences, claiming he had already cleared that sector with his construction crew. We thought he was the rock of the family, a devoted, supportive uncle who was sacrificing his own sleep to bring his niece home. But the truth was far more calculated, far more sinister. The prosecutor stepped to the digital lectern, projecting the original, handwritten logbooks from the June 1991 search grid onto the massive projection screens that line the courtroom walls, the faded blue ink looking like an archival sentence of death under the harsh halogen work lights. She traced the signatures on the volunteer deployment sheets with a slow, mechanical movement that highlighted the pattern of Arthur's movements during the high-intensity weeks of the early investigation. "He didn't just lie to you, Deputy Kincaid," the state attorney stated, her voice rising to a sharp, authoritative pitch that echoed off the high plaster ceilings. "He monitored you. He used his status as a grieving relative to sit inside the nerve center of the law, learning exactly which properties our search warrants were covering so he could maintain a permanent, three-step lead over the net. He utilized your own trust as a counterintelligence shield to protect the trophies he had sealed inside the family's wall drop just 48 hours prior." The cross-examination of the retired deputy was a short, somber affair that highlighted the complete legal bankruptcy of the public defender's office. The defense attorney didn't attempt to challenge the validity of the volunteer logs or dispute the identity of the signatures on the grid maps, recognizing that any attempt to argue with the historical reality of the file would only serve to further alienate the jury. Instead, he tried to suggest that Arthur's presence in the command post could have been driven by a sudden, subconscious panic, a desperate, chaotic necessity to undo the choice he had made in the woods rather than a calculated operation of total concealment. It was a weak, philosophical maneuver that felt completely weightless when contrasted with the cold, hard reality of the microcassettes that had already been played out in the well, a reminder that when the facts of a capital murder file are rooted in the unbribable metrics of science, the strategic lies of the living turn to dust before the gavel can even fall. The prosecution's next witness brought the psychological intensity in the room to an even more devastating crescendo as a forensic behavioral specialist from the State University took the stand, a precise, unemotional woman who specialized in the clinical tracking of organized sociopathic conformity. She had spent weeks analyzing the suspect's complete post-1991 timeline, mapping his employment files, his credit card expenditures, his union records, and his public interactions against the behavioral models established by the FBI's behavioral analysis units. She spoke with a flat, clinical objectivity that stripped the suspect of his grandfatherly mask, describing his ordinary, suburban lifestyle not as a reformation or a penance, but as a highly sophisticated, defensive camouflage designed to shield him from the moral fury of the community he had hollowed out from the inside. She explained how an organized predator like Arthur Lee could slide back into the mundane routine of a suburban breakfast table, mown lawns, and family dinners without leaving a single visible trace of his violence on his clothes or in his eyes, a process known in forensic psychology as structural compartmentalization. The defendant didn't experience the psychological friction of guilt or remorse, the specialist stated, looking directly at the jury with an unflinching, analytical gaze. He experienced the thrill of control, the immense, compulsive satisfaction of knowing that he was the sole custodian of the town's greatest mystery, that he could comfort the mother and carry the father's casket while the evidence of his own voyeuristic stalking operation sat locked just inches above their heads in the attic. His performance as a supportive, protective relative wasn't an afterthought. It was an active, essential phase of the crime itself, a continuation of the same possessive malice that led him to install hidden microphones inside the bedroom walls of a child. The victim's older sister, Sarah, sat in the front row of the gallery, her face completely pale, her fingers digging into the leather straps of her bag with a force that she barely registered as the specialist's words laid bare the absolute cowardice of the strategy that had dictated the script of her life's tragedy. Several members of the jury turned away from the defense table, their expressions a mixture of profound revulsion and chilling intensity as they looked at the gray-haired man who sat with his head hung low, his frame looking remarkably small and pathetic under the blue glare of the dual monitor setups. The narrative of the California cold case had completely evolved. It was no longer just about an unsolved equation from a long-forgotten summer, but about a systematic violation of a household by a monster who had used the very intimacy of family ties as a concrete vault to keep the dark hidden from the light of day. During the afternoon recess, the atmosphere in the high-arched corridors of the building was thick with a heavy, expectant energy. The lines of citizens and reporters crowded around the windows, their voices a low, rhythmic buzz as they reviewed the devastating momentum of the state's behavioral presentation. The title, California Cold Case Solved, Victim's Sister Finds Truth in Attic, had become an absolute, unassailable baseline that was systematically crushing the defense table into total submission before the eyes of the state. Captain Marcus Vance stood by the frosted glass of the exit, his arms crossed, his eyes watching the movement of the local news anchors who were already technical aligning their equipment for the evening broadcasts, realizing that the prosecution had reached the absolute high-water mark of its multi-week siege through the analog archives of 1991. When court reconvened for the final session of the week, the state attorney stood up and requested permission from the judge to introduce the final, most critical physical artifact recovered from the Roseville search warrant, the heavy, analog workbench drawer that had contained the missing 16-year-old girl's silver track meat medals and her missing house keys. The public defender made a final, frantic objection, claiming that the physical presence of the workbench components in the courtroom would be unfairly prejudicial to the jury and that the items had already been adequately documented through the high-definition photographs projected on the screens. But the judge denied the motion with a sharp, authoritative click of his pen, ordering the bailiff to bring the evidence crate into the well of the court. The room went completely silent as the wooden container was opened, the technician lifting the weathered oak drawer onto the central table with a professional reverence that made the small, metallic clinks of the contents sound like gunshots in the quiet chamber. The state attorney stepped forward, her gloved hand lifting the silver track ribbons from the wood, holding them up under the harsh pool of light from the overhead lamps so that every member of the jury could see the tarnished metal and the faded inscriptions from May 1991. "These are not statistics, gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding resonance that put the final period on the state's multi-day presentation of blood and science. "These are the fragments of a life that was violently stolen from this community, trophies that this man kept locked inside his workspace for 35 years to fuel his internal fantasy life while a family rotted away from grief. The state rests its case, confident that the unbribable voice of the evidence has left this defendant with nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide, and no shields left to throw against the unyielding wall of justice." When she sat down, the silence inside the courtroom was so absolute that the sound of the evening rain striking the high geometric windows outside felt like a rhythmic, heavy validation from the past, a confirmation that the long, dark winter of the Sacramento cold case was finally reaching its final, definitive resolution in the light of day. The public defender stood up to announce that the defense would present no witnesses, a quiet admission of complete legal and strategic bankruptcy that left the suspect standing alone on the precipice of a state execution with zero remaining options left to explore. The judge checked his watch, adjusted his robes, and looked at the 12 individuals in the box, his expression one of grim, absolute gravity, as he ordered the court to adjourn until Monday morning for the final closing arguments and the delivery of the verdict. As the deputies stood up to lead Arthur Lee back to the transport van, the clanking of his transport irons was the only answer to the silent fury of the crowd, a sound that signaled the beginning of the end for the monster of the attic, a phantom whose secrets had finally run out of dark corners to hide behind.